Speaker David Osmond, Dr. David Osmond, a wind engineer with Windlab, will introduce wind energy, including siting, historic growth, development, and future predictions. He will also discuss issues associated with obtaining most of our power from variable renewable energy sources. David obtained his BSc in Maths and Physics and his PhD from ANU in Earth Sciences Geophysical Fluid Dynamics. He then worked at the CSIRO in the Wind Energy Research Unit and Windlab after it was spun out of CSIRO in 2003. Windlab Pty Ltd is a global renewable energy development company established to commercialise the world-leading atmospheric modelling and wind energy assessment technology developed by Australia's premier scientific research institute. So with that brief introduction to David, I'll hand over to him to now make his presentation. Thanks, David.
Thanks very much, Kim. Thanks for the introduction, and hopefully you can all hear me clearly.
Yep.
And just
sounding pretty good.
Awesome. And one thing I'd just like to point out is, obviously I work for Windlab and I've got a lot of slides from Windlab, but I'm actually just speaking in my personal capacity because I'm a big fan of renewables and I like talking about them.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, as mentioned, I'll do a brief introduction to Windlab and then a little bit more about wind energy. I'll discuss the process of how Windlab prospects and develops a wind farm site. And then I'll look into just how wind has grown across Australia and the world and where it may go in the future. And I'll also briefly touch on issues associated with obtaining most of our power from variable renewable energy, such as wind and solar. Okay, so as mentioned by Kim in the introduction, Windlab is a Canberra-based global renewable company that was spun out of CSIRO back in 2003. And actually I was at CSIRO with the group while I was finishing off my PhD, and made the switch with them when Windlab was spun out. When we were at CSIRO, we just made maps of the wind. So we basically ran almost like weather forecast models, so similar to what the Bureau of Meteorology uses. But instead of trying to forecast what was going to happen in the weather tomorrow or the next day or the next week, we ran it in hindcast mode, and we ran it over an entire year or more to see what the wind was doing over various parts of Australia, and in particular to make these maps of the wind. And you can see down the bottom of this slide, I've got a map of Australia where it's showing the red and orange and yellow bits are where it's typically windy on average, and the blue bits are where it's generally not that windy. So when we were at CSIRO, wind developers bought the maps from us at CSIRO, so we brought in a fair bit of revenue for CSIRO. And back then, CSIRO was encouraging companies to spin off, and they wanted to commercialise some of the IP that was being developed at CSIRO. And so Keith and Nathan, who are the two founders of Windlab, they led the charge, and a couple of the junior techies, including myself, joined them. So yeah, as mentioned, our background was making wind maps, and now we use the wind maps ourselves to find good sites for wind farms. And you can see some points on this map. We've sort of developed half a dozen wind farms that have been constructed in Australia, along with a few in South Africa and one in Canada. We've also done some work in the United States. Unfortunately, none of them have been successful yet, although we're still hoping a couple may get up. And we also have offices in Tanzania and Kenya, because we have big hopes for parts of Africa as being a big growth market for electricity. Okay, so how big are wind turbines? And the short answer is they're very big, and every year they're getting bigger. And this sort of shows a graph of typical sizes of wind turbines. So in the left-hand side, you've got the 1980s and 1990s, and they're really just as big as, a 3 or 4 story building. And every sort of 5 years or so, the turbine manufacturers bring out a new model, which is bigger, they're bigger in sort of three different ways. So you can see the towers are getting taller. These days, the top of the tower is generally somewhere between 120 and 160 meters. The blades are getting longer. So these days, blades are sort of 70 to 80 meters long. And they're getting more powerful. So the generator that sits on top of the tower, generally these days is 4 to 5 megawatts. So they're getting bigger and they're getting more powerful. And I'm based here in Canberra, and these days, you may or may not be familiar with Black Mountain Tower in the middle of Canberra. It's about 200 meters tall. But I gather most of you from Sydney, so I've put Centrepoint Tower, which is about 300 meters tall. You can see, our current technology is similar to the height of Black Mountain Tower, which is about 2/3 of the height of Centrepoint Tower. Part of me, sort of the engineering part of me, marvels at the wonders of engineering that enables these big things, but part of me also kind of despairs that obviously bigger is clearly a lot more, much more visible thing in the environment. But unfortunately, the economics of wind power encourages bigger as being more economic. One of the lovely things about solar panels is that you don't have quite the same economic imperative for scale. A solar panel on your roof does almost as well as a solar panel in a solar farm, so long as your roof is reasonably well sited. Unfortunately, the same is not the case with wind power. The economics really favour putting big turbines in windy places. A small turbine in your backyard is generally, I don't claim to be an expert, but I just hear so many bad stories about people being disappointed that a small unit in their backyard tends not to perform as well as they hoped. So yeah, as mentioned before, you're looking about 150 meters to the top of a current issue wind turbine. Blades might be another 80 meters, bringing the total height to about 230 meters. You've got a swept area of about 2 hectares. At full power, so if it's nice and windy, they'll produce about 5 megawatts. But obviously it's not always windy. On average, a lot of wind farms, a rough rule of thumb in Australia is, on average, they generate about 1/3 of full power. And we talk about capacity factors in the industry. So a capacity factor of 33% means on average it's producing about 1/3 of max power. And that's fairly typical for Australia. Some wind farms in Australia go as high as 50%, some are as low as 20%, but around about 1/3 is kind of typical for Australia. And a single modern turbine could power about 2,500 homes on average. And I just want to emphasize that on average. So obviously they're producing a lot of power when it's windy and not much when it's not. So you definitely couldn't directly power 2,500 homes from a wind turbine because the power is not in sync with what you're using in the home. But averaged over a year, a turbine could power the same could provide the same amount of energy that about 2,500 homes use over a course of a year. How does it generate so much power? I mean, the main reason is just because it captures a lot of wind. So swept area of 2 hectares is much bigger than a school oval. Every second at a typical wind speed, you've got about 170 of tons of air passing through that swept area. So 170 tons, that's about the same weight as 100 cars. A typical wind speed may be about 30 kilometers an hour. So if you have a think about how much energy you're in 100 cars traveling at 30 kilometers an hour, well, and captures about 40 to 45% of that energy and converts it to electricity, and it repeats that every second. I'm just going to show you a turbine power curve. A turbine power curve shows you how much power a turbine will produce as a function of wind speed. And so I've got 2 curves here. Blue is just the power that's in the wind at a given wind speed, and that just goes as the cube of the wind speed. So if you can see my cursor here, it's just very increasingly going upwards as the wind speed increases. Now, turbines are by no means 100% efficient, so they don't produce the same amount of power as what the wind has. And the red curve is kind of a generic power curve. And this one is, well, several years old now. It's only a bit over 2 megawatts, this turbine, but the shape is typical of what turbines are these days. And I just want to point out a few features. First of all, the cut-in wind speed. So that's the minimum wind speed that a turbine actually starts producing power. And most of them don't produce any power below around about 3 meters a second is a typical cut-in wind speed. Some turbines have a slightly lower cut-in wind speed, some have a slightly higher, but generally they're all around 3 meters a second. But then once you get above that cut-in wind speed, the power that the turbine produces kind of goes up as proportional to the cube of the wind speed. In this part of the power curve, that's where turbines are most efficient. And so I mentioned before, sort of turbines convert about 40 to 45% of the energy of the incoming wind into electricity. And that's in this part of the power curve. And basically the designers are designing the turbines to be most efficient at these kind of most common wind speeds. So sort of 6 to 9 meters a second is where the wind spends a lot of time up at these windy locations. And at these speeds, the ratio of the red curve to the blue curve is about 45%. That's the peak efficiency of the turbine. But then once you get up around 10 meters a second, so 10 meters a second is 36 kilometers an hour, the turbine sort of no longer keeps on dramatically increasing power as a function of wind speed. It starts to flatten off. And then somewhere around 11 or 12 meters a second, or about 40 kilometers an hour, the turbine just produces a constant amount of power regardless of whether the wind speed continues to increase or not. And it keeps on doing that right up to the cutout wind speed. And when the wind speed gets really high, and again, it varies from turbine to turbine. Some have a cutout speed of around 20 meters a second. Some are as high as 25 or 27 meters a second. The turbine will feather its blades, so they're able to adjust the pitch angle of the blades. They'll feather the blades so that the wind no longer exerts a torque on the turbine and it'll stop producing power. And that's basically to protect the turbine. So obviously the high wind speeds put a lot of stress on all the machinery, so they feather the blades to reduce that force. Okay, so Windlab is a wind farm developer, and so we spend a lot of time in our company going out trying to find good wind farm sites. And I guess some of the key characteristics that make a good wind farm site is wind. So you want to be in a nice windy spot with a high average wind speed. You want to be reasonably close to transmission. If you've got a really big project with hundreds of turbines, then you can afford to build a longer power line to connect you to the transmission network. But smaller projects, you want to be really close so you don't have to spend a lot of money on building a lengthy connection to the transmission line. Hopefully the transmission line has available capacity, so it's not always running at full power currently. And you want to know how much it's going to cost to connect to that transmission line. We also consider access and constructability. So some sites are extremely windy, but they may be on top of quite jagged mountains that are just not practical for building a wind farm. Obviously the turbine blades and the tower components are all quite massive, and it's difficult to get these massive components to the top of really steep mountains. So generally we want more rounded hills or flat country rather than really steep mountains, even though the really steep mountains tend to be more windy. Community is obviously a big issue. So we want to make sure that the community is acceptable, is favourable to wind power. And then the key issues as well are environmental and cultural heritage. So obviously we can't build wind farms in national parks, but likewise, even in non-national parks, there are lots of environmental issues we need to consider, and also cultural, are there any Aboriginal artifacts or even European heritage. Planning and constraints. So constraints, limits to how close you can build to houses, how close you can build to roads, how close you can build to power lines, communication pathways. So on top of a lot of mountains are masts that have dishes that beam television or radio, and you can't put the turbine in the middle of those communication pathways. So there's lots of constraints we need to consider whether we can build a wind farm on a particular in a particular area. And there's also market and competition. So are there a lot of competing projects in the area? Can we sell the power? So some of you may know that South Australia probably has the highest proportion of wind power of any state. And for a long time, South Australia had the highest power prices in Australia, and some people like to claim that the reason it had high power prices was because of the wind, but it was really the other way around. South Australia has always had for a long time, had higher wholesale electricity prices than the other states. And so obviously it's a more favourable market if you're able to sell the power for the higher price. Things have flipped the last couple of years, so now South Australia has some of the cheapest wholesale prices, so it's no longer quite as an attractive market. So yeah, Windlab, we spun out of CSIRO where we made maps of the wind, and you can see this insert that we've blown up is just a map of the wind at 100-metre resolution in this coastal part of Victoria. So we take those wind maps and we put them into various software, so GIS software, or also wind farm design software, even just in Google Earth. And we'll put in all the constraints we can see. At this site, we've got these pale blue areas. They represent these communication pathways, which may be TV or radio signals. So we can't put turbines that are in the middle of those pathways. We've got green patches of indigenous forest or pale green planted forest. We've got these houses, and we've put buffers around those because we can't build too close to houses. And so all in the office, this is all done in the office, and we'll have a think about, if we're going to build a wind farm, how many turbines would we put there? Where would they go? How much energy would they produce? And we think, does this look like it's got the potential to be a good site? And we'll also do desktop studies of what we can do of cultural or environmental aspects that may apply to this site. And we'll do some sort of risk matrix like this, where we assess what's the quality of the wind resource, is the site constructible, what's the quality of the market, are we likely to find a buyer of the electricity, what's the grid connection like, what's the land tenure like, are we going to have to sign up hundreds of landowners to get this project away, or they're really big land parcels and we're just going to have to sign up a few big landowners. What are the planning and environmental aspects of this site? Permitting, or what's the community, can we find out any idea of what the community feels about wind power? And we sort of make a risk matrix like this and decide whether we want to try to proceed and develop the site, or whether we just give up and try a different site. And if we decide we want to go ahead, then we've gone from concept stage 0, which is the green polygon at the left of this. We decide we want to start the development process of this wind farm. So if that risk matrix all looks good and we decide we want to proceed, then first step is signing up some of the key landowners. And so someone from Windlab will go out and talk to the landowners and see if they're keen to host some turbines on their land. We also, once we've signed up some landowners, we then go to the validation stage. So that involves putting up some equipment that actually measures the wind speed, because as CSIRO, we make models of the wind, but the models aren't perfect, and we actually need to make actual measurements on the site. And that validation stage normally takes about a year. You generally need about a year of data before you have a bit more confidence about how windy the site is. And while you're getting more and more data, you're getting a better idea of what the wind resource is like, you continue to optimize your turbine layout, decide how many turbines, what size turbines, where they may go. Once you have a year of data, you start to get a much better idea of whether the project may be a goer. And then again, you make a call of whether you want to continue to proceed or whether just to run, take your losses and run at that point. But if your data is looking good and if other things haven't changed, then you start conducting your more detailed environmental impact assessments, do your grid connection studies to see if the power lines can take the power. And the whole way through this, you continue to optimize the turbine layout. Now, if all those things go well, then you proceed to the financing stage, where you try to find partners who are going to provide the debt and equity. So a big wind farm, may cost $500 million or so. Windlab, well, historically had nowhere near that kind of money. So generally, about 3/4 of that money may come from a bank, and the other quarter may come from an equity partner. And so we've got the financial people in Windlab who will go out and seek those partners. And then we also go out to tender for construction. So our company doesn't build wind farms ourselves. We don't have any expertise in designing a wind turbine. We just go out to tender, and the major turbine manufacturers around the world will put in tenders to bids to build the wind farm for us. And then obviously the last two stages are construction and operations. Okay, so going to the environmental impact assessment. So that's obviously a key stage of the development application. And there are lots of things that are assessed here. And I'll just quickly touch on some of them. So, sorry, just excuse me a moment. I'll just have a quick drink of water. So first of all, we do studies about, how is the wind farm going to fit into the landscape. So as mentioned, these are huge structures, 2/3 of the size of Centrepoint Tower. So how visible are they going to be to how many people? Are they going to be inappropriate in the location that they are? And obviously that's something we will have considered right on early on, but you also have to do much more detailed assessment as part of this environment impact assessment. Cultural heritage, archaeology, paleontology. So you'll need to have people from the local Indigenous community do a walk over to the site, see if they can find any artifacts, or maybe they're fossils or other European historical artifacts that may be on the site. So you'll need to assess all of that to make sure you're not disturbing anything important. You've got ecology, biodiversity, and nature conservation. So you'll need to have wildlife experts, your bird experts, your bat experts, your lizards, your flora experts all go over and make sure that there's no endangered animals or plant species or anything across the site. Or if there are, make a plan about how they can be protected. Need to do hydrology assessments, because obviously you need to build roads to construct a wind farm, and roads kind of often affect the water runoff. So you need to make sure that you have a plan that you don't affect the local water flows too greatly. Geology, soils, agricultural potential. So a key thing is generally disturbing good quality agricultural land is not looked upon favourably. So you want to make sure you're trying to use land that is not particularly productive. Shadow flicker is obviously turbine blades as they're spinning around cast a moving shadow, and there are rules about it's quite annoying if your shadow is passing across someone's bedroom window. So you need to do assessments of will your turbines be casting moving shadows on any nearby houses, and if so, how many hours a year are they going to be subjected? So we need to do all sorts of assessments of that and make sure within regulations. Electromagnetic interference is mainly what I was talking about before. We can't put turbines in the path of television or radio communications because we don't want people losing their TV signal. Noise is obviously a key aspect, so we have to make sure we keep within noise regulations at nearby houses. Aviation hazards, make sure the turbines aren't a hazard to planes. And this is obviously a particular case if you happen to be near an airport. Have to do fire risk studies, traffic and transport studies, mainly to do with all the trucks involved with bringing the parts to the site. Local economic impacts and waste. So the first thing was sort of the visual impact. So we can do desktop studies to try to work out how big an area will the wind farm be visible from, and how impactful will you just be able to see the kind of tip of a couple of blades, or will a house be completely surrounded by turbines? So we do all those sorts of assessments. If there are any sensitive locations, so houses or maybe a lookout on the side of a road, we'll need to make photo montages of what the project's going to look like from these particularly sensitive locations. And this is an example of one of those. This is just a neighbouring property of the wind farm. And I don't know if you can see the turbines in the background, but this is just a mock-up of what the wind farm would have looked like that we need to present to the locals. Cultural heritage. So as mentioned, we had Indigenous experts to walk around the site looking for any artifacts. And for one of our wind farms in Victoria, they found this sort of 1 centimetre sized lump of quartz that was thought to be a tool. And so that had to be left where it was, and we had to reroute a road so that it didn't disturb where that stone was found. That's just a map of how we had to move a road to avoid that location. Ecology, biodiversity and nature conservation. So when we go through this development application, we have to submit the region where we're likely to disturb the habitat. So generally speaking, all along the roads that are going to be built, plus a buffer. So that's these sort of blue areas. We submit that to the ecology people, and they'll go and walk the site and look to find any endangered birds, reptiles, frogs, bats, and plants. And they'll go and do lots of detailed studies, put traps, cameras, and just general surveys to try to, I mean, obviously, those experts will already know to a reasonable degree whether there's likely to be any endangered species on your site, but nevertheless, they also go out and do site surveys. And in this case, you can see there's also this green buffer, which is they'll walk out beyond the disturbed area to see if there are any, this is tree hollow bearing tree search areas. So they'll search to see if there are any hollow bearing trees nearby. Obviously, so that's to help to see for nesting spots for birds that may be affected by the wind farm. Some cases they'll do radar to try to just track birds that are flying through the site. This is an example of one of our wind farms in Africa. So it was found that there were bats that were regularly moving throughout the site, and they did extensive monitoring of bats and determined, some areas of the site were high risk, some were medium risk and low risk. And we essentially had to get rid of any proposed turbines within the high risk areas. For the medium risk areas, what they determined were that bats were most active around sunrise and sunset, but only when it wasn't particularly windy. And so what we have to do for this site is, for certain hours of the day, for certain months of the year, we have to switch off the turbine around sunrise and sunset if the wind speed is below a certain speed. And that is just to mitigate the risk of causing bat mortality. And then there was slightly less stringent criteria for the lower risk areas of the site. And so obviously, as we're getting all this feedback from the EIA, we have to then, for the impact assessments, we then go back to the drawing board and decide, how many turbines do we want to move around? Do we want to get rid of? And so we continue that optimization of the project, or in some cases, we just have to ditch the project completely if it's found out that it causes too big a risk to the local flora or fauna. Okay, so moving on to noise. So in most states of Australia, wind farm noise at nearby residences is normally limited to the maximum of somewhere in the range of 35 to 40 decibels, which varies from state to state, or background plus 5. So the maximum of either of those two things. And that's sort of the average noise level. And we may have to meet this or a similar condition specifically at night as well. And that's generally for the non-involved landowners. So that's the neighbours of the project who aren't signed up directly with the wind farm. But involved landowners who have turbines off their land who are receiving revenue for that, they generally have less stringent conditions. And so a typical condition may be a 45 decibels for an involved landowner. So again, as we're designing the wind farm layout, we make sure that we satisfy all those noise regulations. So we've got software that does that. We'll be able to optimize the turbine location that tries to maximize the energy while still keeping noise levels to those required amounts. This is just kind of a noise map that software has produced. So you can see the ellipses represent turbines, and the colors, yellow is very high levels of noise, and the blues and the purples are very low levels of noise. But we can't just do the modeling. We actually have to do measurements to verify that the site is satisfying the criteria. So we'll get out contractors who will do background noise monitoring before we build the wind farm, because the limits are a function of background noise. So if a house is in a particularly noisy area, then the criteria is less stringent than if the wind farm is in a very quiet area. So first of all, we have to do the background noise monitoring, and then once we've built the project and it's operating, we then have to go back out and verify that the wind farm has not increased that noise by more than 5 decibels or above 40 decibels. If it turns out the wind farm's non-compliant, then we generally have to do mitigation strategies, and so that may involve switching off turbines that are close to if there's a particular house where we haven't satisfied the noise criteria, then when the wind's coming from a certain direction, we may have to turn off wind turbines. Wind turbines also have a low noise operating mode. It generally comes at the cost of generating less power. So we don't want to do it unless necessary. But if it turns out that a wind farm is non-compliant, then you can use a low noise, low power mode to make sure you stay within the criteria. Okay, so moving on to the growth of wind power. So these are charts of how much energy wind farms have produced on the NEM. So the NEM is Australia's national electricity market. That's basically most of the electricity in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and Tasmania. So represents about 80% of the electricity that's produced in Australia. And apologies, obviously the numbers are probably too small for you to see, but at the left-hand side of this chart is 2008. And you can see the amount of energy coming from wind farms back in 2008 was almost negligible. And this is financial year ending a few months ago in June 2021. And wind farms were producing about 20 terawatt hours a year, which represent about, was a bit over 10% of the NEM demand at that point. So last financial year, wind farms produced about 10% of NEM demand. So in the space of 13 years or so, it's gone from essentially nothing to 10%. Obviously, we've got a few more months of data since the end of last financial year, and in the last 12 months, wind is now producing about 11% of NEM demand. So too is solar. The majority, probably about 2/3 of that is coming from rooftop solar, and 1/3 of that's coming from utility solar farms. And you can see the blue down the bottom of this represents existing hydro, which you can see has some years that are higher than others, depending on whether it's drought or whether the electricity price is high or low. So anyway, in the last 12 months, the NEM was about 30% renewable, whereas 13 years ago, it was about 7% renewable. So obviously we've seen over a quadrupling of the amount of energy coming from renewables. Going from Australia out to the world. So last year, the world installed about 111 gigawatts of wind power, 127 gigawatts of solar power, and about 60 gigawatts of fossil generation. So the good news is renewables are now the cheapest new forms of electricity around the world, and that's why the world is now installing more wind and solar capacity than it is fossils. And the graph I've got down the bottom just shows the levelized cost of energy from various forms of generation. In this left, we've got various forms of peaking gas plants. So they don't run particularly often. They tend to just turn on when the price of electricity is high. So they've got high levelized cost because they're not running very often, and they're up around $150 to $250 a megawatt hour. And this is a brand new coal or gas power station that's running more of a base load type of profile. That produces power sort of around about $100 a megawatt hour. That's if there's no carbon price and no risk premium. Thankfully, these days, banks are generally applying a risk premium to these because they're worried that the world's going to phase out fossil power. So generally, they're charged a higher rate of interest to cover that risk premium. And so when you incorporate that higher risk premium, you can see most of those are well above $100 per megawatt hour. Now, if we go across to wind and solar, they're generally down around $50 a megawatt hour. And so obviously they're a lot cheaper, but obviously also they're variable. So they're not always producing. We don't get power from solar at night time, and we don't get power from wind when it's not windy. So they're not quite directly comparable, but this report, oh, sorry, I forgot to say before, this is CSIRO's Gen Cost report. So AMO, the Australian Electricity Market Operator, got CSIRO to do market research to come up with these numbers. And so as mentioned, wind and solar are variable, they're not always producing. So CSIRO did detailed analysis of how much additional storage and transmission do you need to complement these wind and solar to achieve particular penetration rates across the national electricity market. And so at a 50% penetration, so bear in mind, we're 30% renewable at the moment, but about 23% of that is coming from wind and solar. So at a 50% penetration from wind and solar, so about double what we are now, those additional costs that come from building extra transmission lines and having extra storage to manage the variability are almost negligible. We're still looking at around $50 a megawatt hour, but those costs start increasing as we get higher and higher renewable penetrations. But once we get up to about 90%, the cost is still quite manageable. We're still looking somewhere around $50 to $100 a megawatt hour, which is still a lot less than new coal. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why around the world we're seeing more wind and solar being built than new fossil generation. But having said that, these studies have to be done for the particular region because obviously some countries have better wind and solar resource than others. But the other thing is how well, if we're getting 50% from wind and solar, where's the other bit coming from, and how well can that manage the variability of wind and solar? So if the other 50% is coming from something that's quite adaptable, that you can ramp up and down, then the integration costs are low. But if the rest of it is coming from fairly inflexible coal, then the integration costs are higher. But we're finding here in Australia that the coal is adapting and becoming more variable in its output. It's not just running at a constant load 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It is ramping its output. And so it is starting to accommodate some of the variability that's coming from wind and solar. Okay, so the good news is wind and solar are now the cheapest, and so it's starting to win the race. But unfortunately, it would be nice if we had started to win this race decades ago, because wind and solar are obviously still only a very small, minor role in the world electricity. So wind is just up above 5% of world electricity. Solar's down around 3%, whereas coal's up around 33, 34%. So, the good news is that the tide is turning. The bad news is, we wish it happened decades ago, because it's going to take a while for wind and solar to really take away a lot of that market share that's currently occupied by coal and gas. Now, going back to Australia, so obviously I'm keen to see more and more renewables, but the main reason for that is because we want to reduce our emissions. And the good news is emissions from electricity in Australia are coming down. They're coming down reasonably rapidly. Obviously, we'd like it to be more rapid, but back around sort of 2014, 2015, the average emissions on the national electricity market were about 0.9 of a tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent per megawatt hour of electricity. And the most recent 12 months were around about 0.65. So that represents a 28% reduction since 2015. As mentioned before, South Australia has the highest penetration rate of renewables, and its electricity intensity has come down over 50% since 2015. So back in 2015, it was 35% renewable. It's now 62% renewable, and its emission intensity has come down by about 56%. Okay, so issues with attaining much of our electricity from wind and solar. So key ones are obviously variability, and this is just a graph I got last night of the last 7 days of generation from wind and solar across the national electricity market. And you can see it's highly variable, and in particular the solar is obviously making these massive peaks in supply, often going from 0 to something around 10 gigawatts every day. So that's causing quite a lot of cycling on the other generators. So how do we manage the variability in supply that's coming from wind and solar? Transmission capacity is becoming a key issue. So can we connect all these new gigawatts of wind and solar that's coming onto the network, or do we need to build new power lines? Inertia, so generators such as coal and hydro have big spinning masses that provide inertia. And just like a small tree falling across a train track, the train will probably just smash through it. It's got a lot of inertia. Small tree falling across in front of your bicycle, the bicycle is going to be thrown off. Similar thing happens in the electricity market. If there's a fault in the electricity market from a power line falling over or a coal power station tripping, if you've got low inertia, it's more challenging than if you've got a system with high inertia. So we're moving towards a system with lower levels of inertia, and we need to work out how to cope with that. And system strength is another one, and that's, well, it's pretty hard to describe, but basically our electricity is delivered by currents and voltages that have a nice sinusoidal shape, and we want it to stay as a nice sinusoidal shape. But if a transmission line falls over, it disturbs that sinusoidal shape, and we want the grid to maintain resilience to disturbances such as that. And the previous grid with lots of coal was more resilient to disturbances like that. The new grid, we have to come up with new ways of maintaining that. And the good news is they're starting to make a lot of headway with both inertia and system strength with batteries. But it's still fairly early days with that, so we'll see how things progress over the next few years. I probably need to finish up soon, so I think I've just got a couple more slides. But one of the good news is the AEMO, so there's the Australian Energy Market Operator, has probably about 5 years ago, it started putting together this ISP, Integrated System Plan. And the reason it did that was it could see that most of Australia's coal is due to retire in the next 20 years, and a fair bit of our gas generating capacity as well. And it wants to make sure it can continue to keep the lights on when this happens. And so it put together this integrated system plan to try to work out, well, what's the most economic way to replace all this retiring capacity while still maintaining a secure and reliable electricity system. And this just illustrates all the retiring capacity of coal power stations over the next 20 years, and some gas. So we're losing almost 20 gigawatts, or almost, well over half of the electricity that's currently produced is retiring in the next 20 years or so. And what's going to be the most economical way of replacing that? And so it did these ISP studies to do that. And it did a variety of ranges of scenarios that, because some of the states have renewable energy targets, so they had scenarios looking at where all the states had those renewable energy targets. It had scenarios looking at whether the costs of wind and solar continued to decrease rapidly or whether they decrease more slowly. They had scenarios where rooftop solar continued to boom or whether it slowed down. Anyway, they had 5 main scenarios: the slow change, central, high, DER, which is basically rooftop solar and batteries and residential batteries, fast change and step change. And they looked at, under all of these 5 scenarios, what would be the most cost-effective way of replacing all the retiring coal and gas capacity. And it is quite a phenomenal body of work they put together to look at these scenarios to make sure that over the next, beyond 2040, that every hour of the day to continue to be a reliable electricity system with demand equaling supply. And they sort of predicted where's the most economic way to build these new wind and solar farms. And these sort of maps of Australia sort of show where there's likely to occur. How much storage will we need? Do they assume that Snowy 2.0 is going to be built or not? All these different assumptions. And they looked at these renewable energy zones where they think the wind and solar is likely to be built, because the current transmission network probably can't, well, definitely can't deal with all these tens of gigawatts of wind and solar farms. So we're going to have to build new transmission lines to these renewable energy zones. And so this whole thing is designed to help guide the various governments with deciding, well, should we help fund these transmission lines so that we can develop these renewable energy zones? So it was a quite impressive body of work. And they looked at how electricity emissions will reduce under the 5 scenarios that were modelled. And you can see the most aggressive scenario was this step change scenario, where they assumed wind and solar continued to come down in price as it has over the last couple of decades. And the step change scenario was 96% renewable in 2042. It had similar costs to the other scenarios, was only a tiny bit more expensive. So it was almost fully decarbonised electricity, but they managed to, according to their simulations, keep the lights on at every instant over all the years that they modelled. And they modelled lots of different reference years, so years where it was windy, years where it wasn't windy, years where there was lots of rainfall so they could have lots of hydro, and drought years. And this is just sort of an indication of how they thought a typical week may look in 2035 under some of the scenarios, in weeks where there was high demand, weeks where there was low demand, weeks where it was really windy and sunny, or weeks where it wasn't, and make sure that they can keep the lights on under all these scenarios. Yeah, so I might leave it there. I think we're pretty much out of time. This is just a nice picture of Canora Bridge Wind Farm, which is one of the projects Windlab built in Victoria, which is helping the ACT meet its 100% renewable target. So on that, I'm happy to hand over and take any questions.
Okay, thanks, David. That was terrific. Very detailed discussion there. I've learned quite a few things. I can't see any questions on the chat line right now. Can you, Adrian? Okay, here's one.
I can see one from Alison.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you can answer that one directly, I think.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so there's a question from Alison saying, are there confirmed plans to combine wind, solar with hydro, particularly at former mining leases with watered dams? And there certainly are. So I guess Gen X is kind of the key one at the moment. So it's an old abandoned gold mine in Queensland, where it looks like they've got financial close on that. So they're going to go ahead and build a pumped hydro system between a high water reservoir and a low water reservoir at the bottom of the old gold mine. And there's already a solar farm next to it, and they're planning on expanding the solar farm. And they're also talking about building a wind farm as well. We're not sure if that'll happen or not. But the idea is that, yeah, when it's windy or sunny, and potentially there's more wind and solar than the grid needs, then they'll use the excess electricity to pump the water from the low dam to the high dam, and then release it to generate power when the electricity really is needed. So are there confirmed plans? Yes, well, Gen X is the key one. There's certainly more additional pumped hydro projects. Some of them are not associated directly with a wind and solar farm, but they don't really need to be co-located. The main thing is we just need the storage. But my personal feeling is that pumped hydro is proving to be like a little bit more complicated and bespoke. Every project is quite different, whereas batteries are proving to be much more replicatable and coming down in price. And so at the moment, you've got a couple of gigawatts of, or maybe several gigawatts of pumped hydro projects proposed, and there's probably a big question mark over a lot of those, whereas we've got over 20 gigawatts of battery projects proposed. And I'd readily admit there are lots of question marks over a lot of those, because there's no way we need 20 gigawatts of batteries in the next few years. We do need it over the next 20 years, but probably not over the next few years. But batteries are just proving more economic than pumped hydro. Now, battery projects are generally shorter duration than pumped hydro, but in the next decade or so, we don't really need long duration storage. We really just need those 2 to 4 hours. That's where batteries are likely to be much more economic than pumped hydro. So I think over the next, other than government-supported projects like Snowy 2.0 and possibly another one in New South Wales, generally batteries are going to be what we're going to see a lot come over in the next decade.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Yeah. There's a couple on offshore wind farms anywhere.
Okay.
And yep. One in Scotland.
Yeah, offshore wind farms anywhere. So for a long time, I thought Australia wouldn't have any offshore projects. So offshore projects are booming in Europe. They're just starting in America. There's some in Asia as well. But generally speaking, people only build offshore once they kind of ran out of good sites onshore. Now, that was true historically. Now, there is a bit of a question mark. I'm starting to change my opinion that maybe Australia will have some offshore as well, even before we run out of good onshore sites. And offshore, the prices of offshore is still a lot more expensive than onshore, but they are coming down. They seem to be coming down reasonably rapidly. So it may prove to be not that much more expensive, in the next 5 or 10 years compared to onshore. But the thing is, onshore in Australia is really starting to become transmission constrained. So building new power lines takes a long time in Australia. It may not happen fast enough for us to continue this big renewable boom that we're currently on. And in the meantime, there may be an opportunity for offshore projects to get up that can connect to strong parts of the network, particularly offshore in Victoria, where they may be able to connect directly to where the coal power stations are, which are nice, strong parts of the network that can take the power. So, yeah, I was originally dubious that Australia would get any offshore projects. Now I'm a lot more open to the idea that it may happen. So, yeah, and there's Victoria, probably the most advanced ones, but there's actually several that have come on proposed in Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria. I'm not sure if there are any in New South Wales, but generally around the south of the continent.
There's one here about what lessons were learned from South Australia blackout.
Yeah, so that was obviously a big wake-up call. So I just to go over what happened. So, we had extreme winds or tornadoes that knocked over 3 high voltage transmission lines. Now, wind farms, along with just about all electrical equipment, I talked about system strength before, and that is we want the electricity to be these nice sinusoidal shape. And when things like transmission lines fall over, they cause these voltage dips. And most generators and even loads are not particularly fond of these voltage dips. And most of them have protection settings that have, if the voltage dips below a certain level, or if there are a lot of voltage dips in a row, then eventually to the sides, the network is not stable and they disconnect. Now, what happened in South Australia was those settings, AEMO wasn't aware of what the wind farm settings were. And the wind farm settings weren't really what they were supposed to be. And so these wind farms disconnected from the grid when the three power lines fell over, all at different times. So the wind farms decided, okay, the network's not stable, we're just going to disconnect. Now, unfortunately, at the same time, South Australia was heavily importing from Victoria, and the interconnector was already close to its maximum. And when the wind farm switched off, the interconnector went over its rated capacity and its protection systems kicked in and it disconnected. And all of a sudden, South Australia, as well as losing power from the wind farms, it lost power from Victoria. And it all happened so quickly that we had a statewide blackout, the first in our history. So anyway, since then, AEMO has been much more stringent about making sure it knows what protection settings applied to every power station. And I should say, in this case, it was wind farms that disconnected, but there have been plenty of instances of other power stations that disconnect when subjected to all these voltage dips. So it's not just wind farms, even though it was wind farms in the case this time. So now AEMO is very, make sure it's aware of what all the wind farms and what all generator protection settings are. And in some cases, it's made the generators upgrade their protection settings so that they withstand more voltage dips before they disconnect. The other thing is when the conditions are like what they are, where there's tornadoes, risking power lines being blown over, AEMO makes sure it doesn't run the interconnector at close to full power, so that if something happens, power stations trip offline, it doesn't overload interconnectors. So basically, it's being more conservative in running the electricity network when conditions are really wild, like they were in South Australia on that day.
So interesting. We've got another one here. Wind turbines. Are wind turbines still on 5-minute running period, hence regularly turning on and off? Is that?
I'm not really sure I understand the question. I mean, the electricity market operates on a 5-minute, every 5 minutes there's an auction. Every generator puts in a bid to supply power. And if they win the bid, then AEMO dispatches them and they're supposed to produce approximately what AEMO expects them to produce. So wind turbines, like every other generator, bid into this market at 5-minute intervals. But generally speaking, they're not turning on and off. They're, every now and again, there will be moments where the price varies rapidly between high price and low price. And so in one 5-minute period, a generator will be dispatched and then the next one won't be dispatched because the prices vary widely. But generally speaking, yeah, they don't regularly switch on and off. So I'm not 100% sure I understand that question.
Okay. Possible wind farm in the Illawarra.
Okay, so there we go. One? Maybe sounds like there may well be one in New South Wales as well. Okay, so when you describe the turbines feathering the fan, is this an independent action or controlled in some remote control room? It's an independent action. So every turbine has an instrument on top of it that measures the wind speed, and it has a pre-programmed setting so that when the wind speed's X meters per second, the blades are pitched at a certain angle, and so automatically when the wind gets above the cutout wind speed, it'll just automatically feather the blades so that it shuts down to protecting those high wind speeds.
When passing wind farms, I have noticed that some turbines are on and others are turned off. Why?
Okay, so there's generally two reasons for this. And if you look at the turbine, you may be able to tell the difference between the two. So in some cases, I mentioned turbines generally have a cut-in wind speed. So around about 3 meters a second or about 10 kilometers an hour, a turbine will start to generate. Now the wind isn't uniform. So sometimes one turbine will be seeing a wind speed of 12 kilometers an hour, and it will be generating and have spinning blades. And another one generally might be a bit lower in a slightly less windy location, and its wind speed may be 8 kilometers an hour and not enough wind. for the turbine to generate. So that is often the case why you'll see some turbines turning and others not. But in other cases, some turbines may be switched off. And so someone could be doing maintenance on the turbine. So turbines have gearboxes and generators that need maintenance. And when someone's in there doing maintenance, they have to swing the turbine off. Now, normally you can tell if that's the case because the blades look quite different because they've adjusted the pitch angle. That's how they switch them off. So if you see one turbine where the blades look like they're pitched at a completely different angle, so some of them may look like the blades are very narrow because the long part of the cord is away from you, so you're only seeing the narrow part of the blades. That's normally the position if you're facing the turbine or the turbine's facing you and you can't see much of the blades because you can only see the narrow part of it. That normally means it's switched off. Whereas if you can see the more fatter part of the blades, then it's switched on. So it could be one of two reasons. Okay, what is the typical productive lifespan for a wind generator? So these days we're looking at 25 to 30 years. So that's another thing that's improved over the last 20, 30, 40 years of wind turbine evolution, as well as getting bigger. They're getting better at making them longer lasting. So every model they start to work out what's the path that's breaking earliest, and they're improving it. So when I first started working in the industry, most wind farms only had a 20-year life. This is sort of 15, 20 years ago. Now most are in the sort of the 25 to 30-year range. But it also is a little bit site dependent. So if you have a really windy site and it may be high turbulence site, then its wind life expectancy may be less than one that's in a slightly more benign site with less turbulence or perhaps a slightly lower wind speed. Do the wind turbines operate at a constant speed and use feathering to adjust power generation, or do they vary in speed? So the answer is they vary in speed. So once you get above that cut-in wind speed of sort of 3 meters a second, they'll start turning, but they'll only start turning slowly. And basically, the most optimal tip speed is proportional to the wind speed. So the most efficient rotation rate is kind of proportional to wind speed. So as you go from 3 meters a second, 4 meters a second, up to 10 meters a second, generally the turbines spin a bit faster and hit a sort of a peak rotation rate of maybe 12 to 14 revolutions per minute. But then once you get above rated capacity, then from there all the way out to the cutout wind speed, then they have a constant rotation rate. As wind turbines get bigger, the rotation rate's getting a bit slower. That's because the amount of noise that they produce is kind of proportional to the tip speed. And so if you've got longer blades, you have higher tip speeds. Well, to stop the tip speeds getting higher, they slow the rotation rate. So new turbines spin a bit slower than old turbines.
Okay.
How much does...
One more if you can address it.
How much does a wind turbine cost? So as a rough rule of thumb, you're looking at about 2 million per megawatt. So a modern turbine may be 5 megawatts. So that would cost roughly about $10 million. So that's the fully installed cost. So that includes all the construction, it includes the connection to transmission, the building the roads, all those sorts of things. But yeah, as a rough rule of thumb, 100 megawatt wind farm would be about $200 million.
Mm-hmm. How are you going, David?
Yep, I'm happy to keep on going.
Okay.
Are landowners generally more receptive to having wind turbines? In general, yes, but obviously it does vary greatly from site to site. So some communities have had bad experiences, and there's no doubt that some wind farm developers haven't done the best community consultation in previous years. I'd say the industry as a whole is getting much better. But some communities have been burnt. They've been divided by potential wind farm sites, and generally Windlab will try to avoid communities that have really have bitter experiences with a proposed project. So in general, I'd say in general, landowners have nearly always been very receptive to wind farms because they get a lot of money from host turbine. It's more the neighbours. So, and historically, one of the big problems with the wind industry is that the landowners get lots of money and the neighbours get nothing. And so that's one thing. And Windlab was actually pioneering in this. Actually, in this slide, Canoa Bridge Wind Farm was pioneering wind farm, and it won awards because we were one of the first projects that spread the benefits a little bit more widely. So we provided money to some of the neighbours. I should say pretty much all wind farms provide money to a community fund that helps various things throughout the community. But most of them don't pay money to the neighbours, and that's been one of the problems historically, is that it causes divisions between the people who host turbines and get money and the neighbours who don't get anything. And so some of them are following what we did with Canoa and starting to give some money to some of the nearby neighbours as well. But another thing is, I'm sure a lot of you remember, perhaps 15 years ago, there was an extraordinary amount of negative publicity about the various ills that wind farms were causing. It was making people sick. They were said to be outrageously noisy, causing all hosts of health problems. And to be honest, most of that was really just a symptom of these divisions of people who were getting lots of money and were for it, and the neighbours who were against it. And really that division was just helping to blow up. They were looking for any reason to fight against the wind farm. So, projects like Canoa that distributed revenue more evenly had much less division. But I should say also 20 years ago, these days the noise regulations are quite stringent. 20 years ago, those noise regulations weren't around, so that there were some wind farms that were probably built too close to houses that weren't getting any revenue. And so they were probably being subjected to unreasonably high noise levels. And I'm not saying it was really noisy, but it's just more noisy than you'd really expect to get unless you're receiving some revenue.
David, okay. I've got a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Adrian here. Regarding just building on the community benefits, do you know of any projects where the communities have actually benefited from lower electricity prices?
Yeah, I'm not actually. I guess, and actually, I think it was Ray asked me this before the talk began, or maybe I'm wrong, maybe it was someone else. But the electricity that a wind farm produces generally speaking, it gets fed into the high voltage transmission lines. So, and it's at a much higher voltage than a house can use. So generally speaking, it's not as if you can just siphon off some of the electricity for the local residents. It goes into the transmission network, and they just continue to get electricity. Now, a wind farm could just decide, well, we can just pay your electricity bill, but it would be like a completely separate, it'd just be a financial thing. It's not really a fact that the wind farm is providing the electricity for those households, it's just paying those bills. But then, then you become involved with issues. Well, if one house is using hundreds of megawatt hours a year and another house is only using a couple of megawatt hours a year, is that really equitable if you're paying or subsidizing the bill of higher use? So generally speaking, they just have financial, they just base on everyone gets sort of the same financial benefit regardless of whether they're a high or a low electricity user. So generally speaking, I haven't seen anyone that's just provided discount electricity.
Okay, thanks, David. Look, there's just one more. How great is the risk of bird strike? And I think we'll make this the last question. Thanks.
Sure. Yep. So, I mean, so again, you know, the environment impact assessment these days is pretty stringent. So these days, you know, 20 years ago, or maybe even more, there were some wind farms, particularly in Spain and California, that were built in bird migratory routes. So, yep, routes. And moreover, some of these wind turbines actually had lattice towers. So generally speaking, these days, all wind turbines have tubular towers, but in the old days, they had some of them, the smaller ones had lattice towers where birds actually built their nest in the towers. But anyway, there were a few instances where wind farms did cause a lot of bird mortality. These days, the risk is greatly reduced, well, partly because of these tubular towers. Another thing is because they're a lot taller, there's much fewer birds that are actually flying higher up at the heights that the blades are going. So that's also helped reduce bird strike. But the main thing is just these environment impact assessments that we have to do. So we have the bird experts come through, they identify any species of risk. And if so, generally, you know, we may have to modify the layout to avoid those areas. And then, you know, we do pre and post every operating wind farm in Australia. You know, if they find a bird strike carcass on the ground, it has to be logged and recorded. And so these days the regulations are very strict. You know, and clearly wind farms are still killing birds, and there've been a lot of studies to show that. I mean, it's highly variable, but you're looking at a couple of birds per year per turbine sort of seem to be what a lot of them are finding. but yeah, generally speaking, the risk of bird strike has reduced greatly in the last 10, 20 years.
That's a good note to have the last question. Thanks, David. That's been fascinating to hear all this information. I'd like to call on Graham Fry now to give you a formal vote of thanks from Oatley Flora and Fauna for presenting tonight.
Thank you, David. That was a really fascinating presentation. As someone who used to work in the electricity industry, in fact, was involved in both sorting out or selecting generation and later on in building power lines, I find it this is quite an interesting little talk to say how things have changed so much from the period when I was involved. We had no alternative energy, all just oil, either coal, brown coal, or black coal. That's as far as we went, and a bit of hydro. So things have certainly changed dramatically. And I was fascinated by your caustic and how shows how low the alternative energy costs have become, and how it's really no longer feasible to build a new coal-fired or gas-fired power station, which is fabulous in the long term, but we really need to make short-term decisions. And this would be really reliant on the government, particularly the federal government, start doing something and taking the whole issue of global warming more seriously. So Dave, that was a great talk. I really enjoyed it and learned so much. I had no idea that the complexity of actually designing a site for a wind turbine, and then and all of the studies you have to go through to make sure that the site is still suitable. So once again, thank you, Dave. It was a lovely talk, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me. I love talking about renewables, and hopefully I like people bringing around the idea that renewables are a really good solution for decarbonising our electricity.
Yeah, that's great. That's terrific. Thanks, David. Look, you're welcome to stay around, but I know you you want to get away. So just say once again, thanks very much, and we hope to see good things come out of Windlab and more wind farms built around the world to increase that percentage of the overall energy production. So thanks again, David.
Thank you very much.
See you later.
Yeah. And
You
I'm
just
not sure,
wanna-
you might need to stop share.
Yep, stop sharing.
think-
You stop sharing. And
Oh, there we go.
we'll
Yep,
get out of
yeah,
there.
and now I can leave. Yep,
Yeah,
okay, well,
that's
good night,
it.
everyone.
Right, good night.
Thank you for having me, and
Thank you very
all the
much.
best. Cheers, bye.
Okay. Am I muted? No, I'm not. And just a quick reminder to everybody, if you can hear me out there, most of our talks this year are on our YouTube channel. So just scroll down and click on the button on the website homepage and you should get to it. And if you subscribe, you won't miss out on future videos. I think we've got just about all the talks on our YouTube channel. One of them's just on a normal PDF site, but they're all there. So if you need to go back to them and look at some of those graphs and charts and get down the particulars, then they're available.